it again? Tell it again, you say? I've already told you everything I know. I've even told you what I don't know.
Well, what about the people that just arrived? Tell them too.
The heavy door opened and shut quickly as two more men entered the small room. Claudius supposed this was a storage room, but he wasn't sure. It was too dark. The only light was a slit of afternoon sunshine creeping through the opening of wooden shutters and streaking across the face of listeners. A few asked questions, a few shook their heads. All sat with eyes fixed on the young soldier whose story they longed to hear, but didn't know whether to believe. Claudius took a deep breath and began his story again.
I wasn't supposed to work that night. I'd worked over the Sabbath and was exhausted. In fact, I had been on duty since Friday morning.
I remember your face. You were on the hill.
I was assigned the Golgotha detail a month ago.
Ugh.
I didn't ask for it, I was given it.
Go on. Finish the story.
Claudius again shifted his weight. He had never imagined himself in a room full of Jews. The contrast between his trimmed hair and short uniform and their beards and robes only added to his discomfort. He eyed his sword on the floor at his feet. His Roman shield leaned against the adobe wall. Coming here was a dangerous move. He had been uneasy ever since he had arrived in Jerusalem a few months back. Certainly wasn't his choice of a place to serve, but when Rome sends, soldiers obey. Besides, he told himself a year in a peaceful outpost couldn't be too bad. Wrong he was. Jerusalem was far from peaceful. The Jews hated the soldiers distrusted the Jews. If it wasn't the priests' complaints, it was the zealots' riots. Forget casual strolls down the street and keeping the peace. Jerusalem was a hotbed of anger. Anger at Rome, anger at the world. They called themselves the people of God, some nation of God. No navy, puny army, no emperor, just a temple, a Torah, and some strange rules about the Sabbath. Claudius had been trained to respect strength and size, neither of which he found here. Until last night. What he saw last night he'd never seen in Rome or anywhere else. When he told his officers about it, they told him to keep quiet. He couldn't. He had to have some answers. So he came here. These people wanted answers too, so they let him in. They were easy to find. Every soldier in the city knew where they were hiding, the upper room of the large white corner house. It was the same place they had met last week when he was still here. One by one, they drifted back into the room, each entering with a knock on the door and a shameful nod. And when Claudius learned how they had run away and left him alone, he was amazed that they had returned.
Why are you still here then? Why don't you just go home?
If you saw the things we've seen him do, you'd stay too.
Sounds like he has.
For by now they all knew that what had happened at the tomb, or better, they knew something had happened at the tomb. No one quite knew how to explain it. Claudius picked up his story where he'd left off.
When I first saw him being led up the hill, I noticed immediately he was different. He didn't demand we let him go. He didn't shout or resist. And when we hammered the spike into his hand was held still. He didn't fight or resist at all.
Sounds like something you'd do.
He never seemed angry. He never blamed anyone. People were cursing and laughing at him, but not once did I see his eyes lose their calm.
No one moved as Claudius spoke. When he had shared these events with his superiors earlier in the day, they had scoffed. It didn't matter to Romans how Jesus acted, but it mattered to these people. They wanted to know every detail. For the first time, Claudius felt a camaraderie with his listeners, a camaraderie based on a fascination with one man.
Forgive them, I heard him say. And when he spoke, I looked up. He was looking at me. His face was a mask of blood and spit, but he was praying for me. After the crucifixion, I helped lower the body and lay it onto the ground. I waited as these women, I waited as they prepared the body, and then I saw that it was placed in the tomb. I thought that my day was over. It took 4 men to close the grave's opening with a huge stone. And when we turned to leave, word came that Pilate and the temple leaders were nervous that someone would steal the body. We were told to seal the tomb and stand guard all night. There were several of us, so we built a fire and took turns. I was the first to sleep. When they woke me up for my turn, it was an hour before dawn, and the night was black, blacker than any night that I can remember. The moon was small, and the stars were hidden by the clouds. I stood on one side, another soldier stood on the other. He laughed about how easy it was to guard a tomb. Not often does a Roman soldier get guard duty in a cemetery. Maybe we dozed off, because at first I thought I was dreaming. But then the ground began to shake, violently. It shook so hard that I fell to the ground. Rocks fell from the walls behind us. Sparks flew from the fire. Soldiers asleep on the ground jumped up, and I knew that they were standing, because when the light hit them, I could see their faces like it was broad daylight.
What light?
You tell me! Where on earth did that light come from? The rock rolled back and the light roared out, a burst of fire with no heat. A gust of wind blew from the tomb, put out the fire, knocked us back, and the next thing I knew, the tomb was empty. I looked at the soldiers. They were just as stunned as I was. About that time, these two women appeared.
That's when we saw the angel. He was sitting on the rock. He told us that Jesus was no longer here. He told us that he was no longer dead.
Impossible!
She's right. Let her speak.
Why did he let them kill him if he is the Son of God? It doesn't make any sense.
It doesn't make any sense why you can't believe.
John, you were there. You went to the tomb. Is that what you saw?
Peter and I saw the tomb. It was open and empty, but we didn't see Jesus.
I have a question. Okay? I've told you what you wanted to know. Now you tell me what I want to know. This has been on my mind ever since I put the stake in Jesus' hand. Who is this man? Who is this Jesus?
Is there any doubt? I saw him. I saw him risen from the dead. He is who he says he is. Jesus is alive.
That's impossible.
No, it's not impossible. You have to listen.
Why did he let them kill him if he is the Son of God? It doesn't make any sense.
It doesn't make any sense why you can't believe.
Claudius was silent. What he was hearing he could not handle, but what he had seen at the grave he could not deny. He leaned over, put his elbows on his knees, and buried his face in his hands, and thoughts rumbled in his head. He was so intent that he didn't notice the sudden silence. Stillness reigned for several seconds before he raised his head. A light filled the room. He looked at the door and the window, and they were still closed. Faces that had been cast in shadows now beamed. All eyes stared in his direction, but not at him, but behind him. But before he could turn to see what they were seeing, a hand was on his shoulder. When Claudius turned and looked at the hand, he found the answer for his heart.